Do you guys remember in 2009 where Sony announced The Last Guardian and then there was tons of delays and then not talking about it and avoiding it, then re-revealing it and it finally coming out 7 years later? Well, there's a lot of games still like that, yet they haven't come out yet, and so we're going to be looking at those games. Now, before we get to our first game, it's worth defining what we're going to actually be taking a look at here, which is mostly Vaporware games. Vaporware being a title that's been announced, but never technically officially canceled. And I will admit, there are some games in here that have been canceled, but I say that because we're trying to look at games that still have a chance of coming out, despite what the developer or publisher may have said. So, admittedly, there are hundreds of games that have the same story of The Last Guardian that just straight up do get canceled, never come out, the developer closes this, that, and the other. And that's very true. You know, we're going to try to avoid titles that have a pretty good amount of certainty that they will never come out and focus instead on games that, you know, in one way or another, I think do have a plausible chance of actually coming out. And so, here are all the games that we are still waiting for on PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4. And we will start with Kingdom Under Fire 2. This game was announced January 2008, and it's an MMO, an RTS, and an RPG meshed into one. And over the years, this game has suffered multiple delays and has changed dramatically. But developer Blueside has made a decent effort in being transparent about the project and what's going on with it. And being a very PC-centric game, it was in fact slated to come to PS3 and Xbox 360, which ultimately never happened. Then, the same month the PS4 launched, the developer announced a PS4 version was on the way. But the game has done private testing and an open beta for Asian territories that later closed. Then the game launched in Russia, which closed in 2019, which brings us to our most recent update, being that the game finally found a publisher for Western territories, coming to PC at some time later in 2019, which is seeming increasingly unlikely given that we don't have much of 2019 left. But that previously announced PS4 version, yeah, still nothing. Now, let's get to a title that I think some people do remember, and it takes us back to November 2013 when the PS4 was announced, Deep Down. And it's reminiscent of the PS3's early game trailers, where the footage isn't gameplay at all, and yet we were told that it is. Either way, this game is a cooperative free-to-play dungeon crawler from Capcom, and it was poised to be using this new game engine, Pantaray, which was designed for the 8th generation of game consoles. Now, actual gameplay was revealed at TGS 2013, the same year, giving us a realistic glimpse of what has been made so far. And the title was supposed to be released in 2014, but that didn't happen. By 2015, it was noted that the game's original vision expanded, and thus the release was pushed back. The last major update was June 2018, where Capcom extended the trademark, and that's not a guarantee the game's still coming, but holding the trademark is always a good indicator that some form of interest is there, and given the extensive investment of a new engine, and the footage already looking pretty significant, I would say there's still hope for this one, and this game was never canceled. You know, this still had the trademark going, so there's always hope there. But next up, we're going to be talking about Wild, which was announced during Gamescom 2014 as a second-party exclusive for PS4, being published by Sony and directed by the creator of Rayman, Michel Ancel. You play as a tribe member in this Neolithic period, where you have godlike abilities to communicate with and even summon animals. We got a pretty extensive look at the gameplay during Sony's 2015 Paris Games Week press conference, and many gamers were very impressed with what they saw. However, we haven't had much news regarding the title since. Occasionally, Michel will reiterate the game is still in development, but these updates are far and few between, and Sony did file a new trademark for the game though. That was very recently, March 2019. And based on the nature of Sony's involvement and the footage that was previously shown, there's likely a substantial investment here, which leads me to believe this game will indeed come, but is facing a lengthy amount of trouble. Sony's been on record of supporting the creative direction of games in recent years, and understanding the need of a longer development time. Like, if the game needs it, Sony's going to allow that. So I think realistically this one would be a platform shift, which would be PlayStation 5, and would also include a re-reveal, just like The Last Guardian. Now, while we're talking about the game director Michel, that's a good segue into our next game, Beyond Good and Evil 2. This is another project of his, a game which early on, never really got a proper announcement in all fairness. It started with a teaser trailer in 2008, and that was very brief. And then another trailer which was leaked and not officially released by Ubisoft, that appeared in 2009. There were plenty of rumors and even confirmation of the game's development throughout the years, but aside from that, nothing meaningful. So by 2016, which brings us to a 7-year drought more or less of news with that game, Ubisoft was forward in saying that the game's director Michel Ancel was working on both Beyond Good and Evil 2 and Wild, kind of implying that his time was split between both projects. But a year later, during Ubisoft's E3 press conference, the game was finally re-revealed, now being directed as a prequel rather than a sequel. Since then, nothing major has been reported other than Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot being pretty optimistic about the universe and its potential. Ironically, no platforms were ever specifically named, though you'd imagine back in 2008, 7th generation consoles were expected, and now we're expecting 8th gen. But perhaps how slow development has been, maybe they're eyeing up the 9th. Another title that appears to be in limbo and may not actually come out now, even though it seemed like it was going to, is Tekken Cross Street Fighter, originally announced during the 2010 San Diego Comic-Con alongside Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and that actually did come out in 2012 on multiple platforms. So where exactly is the Tekken-designed crossover? Well, over the years, the development was reconfirmed a number of times, until 2016, where the series director, Katsuhiro Harada, stated the game's development was officially on hold. In 2018, he confirmed this again, but also revealed that the game was about 30% complete. The latest news is that Harada still wants to pursue finishing the game, but he's not sure it's a wise idea considering Tekken 7 is doing so well on its own. He also previously mentioned years ago he was concerned about splitting the player base between Tekken 7 and Street Fighter V with another game. In situations like this, the code, assets, everything's still there, just not actively being worked on, but the longer the game goes on without getting development attention, it could end up costing a lot more just to start it up again, assuming you even try to move it to new hardware, which would be a likely scenario at this point. The next game here that I think had a lot of potential actually is Hellraid, developed by Techland, the same team behind Dying Light and Dead Island. The game was revealed in 2013 and is a first-person mix of Dead Island and Elder Scrolls, which would be based on randomly generated content. Now, originally it was announced for PS3, 360, and PC as a downloadable title, but later this was moved to PS4 and Xbox One. In 2014, the game was delayed, and then in 2015, it was announced as being officially on hold, due to it not meeting the developers' expectations and them wanting to flesh out Dying Light more. The concept and footage looks promising, and since it hasn't been on the back burner for too long, I'd say there's still actually a good chance you might see this again. I would hope so. Now let's get into some lesser known titles, or maybe totally forgotten ones, and certainly some older ones, but this one is Identify. This was revealed at E3 2005 as a new iToy game for the upcoming PlayStation 3, which showcased 2 female spy agents being directed by a human player. As in, the camera would face you, and you would be inserted into the game and give commands to the AI, and then you'd watch the scenes play out. Back then, it wasn't even really fully understood if this was a full game or just another tech demo, but Sony's history has shown us that a lot of their tech demos actually go on to be developed into full games. So it's almost surprising to see this game wasn't a part of the PlayStation 9's first round of experimental releases on PSN. Sony still owns the IP, but I doubt we'll ever see something like Identify again. This seems like more wishful thinking than anything else, but this was publicly revealed at some point, and it's an IP that Sony has. Now, while we're talking about E3 2005, this is a great segue into 2 games, 8 Days and The Getaway 3, yes. Both of these games were more or less just tech demos in 2005, but behind the scenes, both of these were being developed by Sony's London studio, and this was around the time that Team Soho was already absorbed into SCE London, so the developer was doing multiple projects from all the staff that was now a part of the team. 8 Days was a new IP, being a third-person shooter. The story was taking place over the course of 8 days, set in 8 different states, and you'd play as 2 different characters separately, and at a certain point in the story their paths would cross. And The Getaway 3 would be the sequel to the already established open-world action franchise that Sony released on the PlayStation 2. Both of these games were slated for the PS3 and used to demonstrate the PS3's power. That's why they were used as tech demos early on in 2005. Though at the time, both of these trailers were under heavy scrutiny as they were being labeled as gameplay, and yet they weren't because they were more in line with pre-rendered footage. Basically, both these games were confirmed to be canceled by Sony in 2008. This was right when Phil Harrison left the company and Shuhei Yoshida took over Sony's worldwide studios. And this was so the developer could focus on bigger franchises like SingStar and opportunity projects like iPet, of all things. But at the time, remember, this was seen as an opportunity for the idea of iPet, even though it ended up bombing. Shuhei Yoshida also noted that the company was trying to focus on multiplayer efforts, and due to lack of an online mode for 8 days, that's another reason why it was canned. However, In 2009, London Studios' Nicolas Doucet mentions in a GameSpot interview that the games aren't cancelled, but rather they were put on hold, and that they were around halfway done actually. Also, in a 2011 Eurogamer interview with a former London studio employee, Richard Bunn, he said 8 Days needed about another year of development time to complete. Both games were actually much further along than most people seem to realize, and yet going through with them still would have cost millions on top of what was already spent. Despite these games having been long labeled as cancelled, it's hard to ignore the mention of them being on hold, the revelation of how far along they were, and the fact that Sony still holds the rights to these franchises. It's entirely plausible, though a stretch, that we could see these games return in some way, shape, or form. Now, returning back to lesser-known games, 2 Days to Vegas has been MIA for a very long time, and yet has never officially been canceled. Development began in 2003 for this action-adventure game where you travel across the US to get to Vegas in order to help your younger brother. The game was slated to release on PS3 and Xbox 360, but hasn't had any meaningful updates since 2009, where IGN confirmed the game was still in development. Now, if you check the developer's website, the game is still under their listed projects next to all their other releases, which did actually come out, and they were like smaller iOS releases or a PS2 game here or there, but this is the only thing on there that hasn't been completed. And so it's not like the developer is defunct. Something is there at the studio, and for now, it just might not get revisited, or maybe it's just in development hell. Moving on to a game that had a very different scenario compared to everything else in this video is 6 Days in Fallujah, a third-person tactical shooter for PS3, 360, and PC that tells the story of the war in Iraq. It was supposed to follow a squad of US Marines over a period of 6 days, taking place in November of 2004. The game was announced April 2009, with Konami being the publisher. And immediately the game was seen as highly controversial for covering such a sensitive topic that was still very fresh in people's minds. Weeks later, Konami decided to drop out of publishing the title. Developer Atomic Games continued to search for a publisher, but no one would agree to sign on. Studio president Peter Tamte assured everyone the game was still coming and was mostly complete. As time pressed on, the developer suffered layoffs and eventual closure in 2011. As recently as 2018, Tamte stated the game was still not cancelled. All the assets and code is there and will eventually release. When and how is still a big TBD. The game is obviously aged and would certainly need to be ported to new hardware, but there's also plenty of self-publishing options that he could have pursued as well, so it's more complex to wonder why this game hasn't shipped. There may never be a good time to release this game given its circumstances, but waiting any longer probably isn't going to be doing it any favors. And finally, we get to the most mysterious title here, Agent. This was announced during Sony's 2009 E3 press conference as a PS3 Rockstar Games exclusive. This was a huge deal at the time, Rockstar being this big publisher with top-tier games under their belt, and Sony landing a major exclusive with them. But the history we know so far paints a much more complicated picture. The game started as a proof of concept after Angel Studios was acquired by Rockstar in 2002. The team that eventually became Rockstar San Diego worked hard to create a vertical slice of the game to show their new parent company, all the while improving their engine to make it into a full-blown project. At a certain point, the team was told to start doing Western assets, which then led to Red Dead Redemption. This is where Rockstar started to spread a lot of their work across their multiple studios, so it's on record that Agent continued beyond San Diego, while Red Dead was being worked on too. Agent just never came to fruition, but instead had many of its assets used in Red Dead and even Grand Theft Auto allegedly. Adding fuel to the fire, the trademark was constantly renewed over the years until 2018, where it was officially deemed abandoned by the Patent and Trademark Office. Despite Rockstar still having Agent listed on their main site, it seems like this is one title that has very little hope of ever actually coming back. So admittedly, this last one right here, I'm going to say this one's donezo. But that, everybody, are all the PS3 and PS4 games that we are still waiting for. And, well, to be fair, if any of these come out, they're not going to be on PlayStation 3, certainly. So that's kind of a misnomer. But the thing about all these games is that they actually have a much deeper history for some of them. So admittedly, we can do separate videos on some of these games entirely, like Agent or like 8 Days and the Getaway. There's a lot more discussion to be had there, but of course we're covering multiple games, so that's why we had to move through these in a somewhat reasonable fashion. Development hell is real, and it's no fun for any studio to be faced with these kind of circumstances, whether to have to abandon a project, the publisher drops funding, tells them to move on, the publisher dies, this, that, and the other. There are a lot of games that end up being canceled, but it's a rare circumstance when it becomes Vaporware, where it never really gets canceled, and it's just kind of in this weird purgatory of game development where it may or may not come out. And a lot of the times, these IP, they still live on with the publisher or some rights owner that could potentially do something with them if they want to, even if their original developer isn't attached to the project anymore. That's why some of these games could still see the light of day. This is how Duke Nukem Forever still eventually came out. So it's a possibility for sure. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't yet, please subscribe for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. And you can follow me on Twitter at MysticRyan, because over there I posted a link to a Japanese Resistance 2 ad that you should really watch. See, this is why you should follow me on Twitter, because I show you all the weird, quirky things in PlayStation history that you would have never known about. Although, to be fair, you probably shouldn't have known about for your own well-being. I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.